So we'll be reviewing Cortazar's UI in this pull request. This is the first PR of the MVP. And Cortazar is a text recommendation engine. For more, I suggest that you can to look my last video. And in here, the storage grid is relatively simple. It comprises four code files, and two documentation files. And I want to start with the documentation because, while obvious, it is important to understand that the first thing before creating a feature is understanding what will be created. So in this case, I created the user stories for the whole application. That includes looking at the top 10 recommended stories, connected to a Twitter account, trying the service out, etc. And then I added the roadmap. So I divided the roadmap in four stages. First, the layout, that is the present PR. Then the offline script to make the recommendations, to grab the recommendations. Finally, how the recommendations will start in the browser, in the application, in the React app. And finally, the requirements for launching the app. So after understanding the documentation, let's take a look. This is a React application. So the app TSX is relatively simple. It only involves a navbar and a grid. This is the navbar. This is the grid. And I'm using Bulma as a CSS framework. To move into the navbar, it's also relatively simple. It has a pricing button that's in here. And then the navbar has a state that it's active, and that is for responsiveness, because the pricing is under a hamburger menu in mobile, and the process is relatively simple. It's when it clicks on click the hamburger menu, it's active, and on click it's not active. So I'm using a boolean to change the state. Now, to move into the grid, before mentioning, I want to say that I made a switch on the grid, because at the beginning I tried to make 3 stories by row. So this is a row. I wanted 1 story, 2 stories, and 3 story, and 3rd story. I thought this was a better approach at the beginning, but based on how I started to look how the app was seen, I decided to move with a single grid per story. A second comment that it's before I show that file is that at this moment I'm coding without seeing the UI, which I highly recommend, because you can speed up and you can only lay the foundations, and then after at this stage, pre-launch, you start styling, and that's when you run the app. You maybe start debugging it at some point earlier, but the important thing is to move as fast as possible. Now, with that being said, the grid at the beginning had a slightly complicated mathematical operation to subdivide the original stories list into a list of lists. In particular, a list of 3 item lists. So I'm using the modus to make new rows. This is the row. So I'm creating new rows. So I'm creating first a list of stories, a list of stories. So if the item is 3rd, I create a new item, and if it doesn't, I map it and I add it to the last row, and in that way I can create the stories. And finally, for the stories component, relatively easy. It's just a card item which has a title, a subtitle, an introduction, a match, and a score. And this is why I started to change the layout, because there was too much text brought together, and this layout is way more cleaner. So thanks for seeing, and I see you next.